Hey everybody, my name's Ed. Okay, we've got another random comic book review. This one is True Love #1 from 1986, published by Eclipse Comics. And what this is basically a reprint of old 50s comics, 50s romance comics that fall into the public domain. So let's take a little look at this. Okay, so the cover is by Dave Stevens. This is the same Dave Stevens who was the creator of Rocketeer. And on the editorial here, they kind of give you a little bit of background about this particular comic and whatnot. Basically, they talk a little bit about the whole romance genre. They mentioned that it was more or less created by Jack Kirby and Joe Simonson when they published, or not Simonson, Joe Simmons, Joe Simon, Joe Simon, when they created Young Romance back in, well, here it is, 1947. They also mentioned that before Kirby and Simon did that comic, there was a magazine called My Date that had a lot of Hollywood stuff in it as well as comics, but that kind of opened the door a little bit for these type of comics. And the thing is, romance comics were really big in the 50s and 60s, and they pretty much died off by the I'd say the mid 70s, yeah, mid late 70s or so. And it's always been really interesting to me because of course, women and girls didn't stop being interested in like material that had romance in it. Soap operas were still big, romance films were still big, romance novels were still big, date movies and whatnot. But this particular format kind of died off for whatever reasons. I'm not an expert. I'm not super educated on the genre, or whatever. The few that I have read, I've read some here and there, but like I said, I'm not an expert. The editorial talks about how the comics and the stories in this strip were from a company called Standard that actually had slightly more mature stories. I don't know. I'll leave that up to whomever to judge. But okay. Okay, so I want to start with the second story. I actually think the first story is probably the best, so we'll come back to that one. This story here is Wrong Way to Happiness, and the art is by V. Coletta. That's Vince Coletta. I always remember Vince Coletta for being an inker in the 60s and 70s for Marvel. At least that's where I know that art from. And he would be inking guys like, I most associate him with being an inker for like Jack Kirby and sometimes George Tuska. That's where I always remember seeing it, seeing his name associated with. And of course, he's done other people's inks on other pencilers and whatever. But that's what I remember being a little kid back in the day. So in this story, we have this girl here, and she's kind of hanging out on the beach or whatever. She meets this dude, and they get together, and they kind of hit it off. And she like helps him fix his boat, and they go on a little date to the little carnival or whatever, and they're having fun, and they're getting to know each other, and everything's fine. And he's kind of secretive about where he comes from, what his past is, but they still continue to hang out, and they get a little bit closer, a little bit closer, and um, you know, maybe things are going to be developing into something really more serious. And as they get a little bit more serious, he kind of runs off, and he doesn't tell her what's wrong or anything like that. So she figures out where he lives, and then she sees this older lady. I'm not who this older lady is. I guess a neighbor or something. It's not really made clear. And the old lady is like, "Oh, so you're that girl?" And so the older lady tells what happens. Basically, the guy was in the army and he was wounded some kind of way, and the doctors told him that we're eventually going to have to cut your leg off. And so that's why he left the girl, because he felt that she shouldn't have to be married to a cripple or whatever. And she goes to look for a dude, and she finds him staying at some dingy apartment or a dingy motel or something. And she goes in there and she starts cleaning up for him. And she basically tells him, you've got to be strong. You've got to fight for this and fight this. And then he says, you know what? Okay, you're right. And then so they get together. All right. Okay. So this next one is Heart Divided, art by Alex Toth. This is Toth and Pepe. Alex Toth is one of these guys that, the more you dig into like the history of comics, you realize how much this guy was really revered. He just had such a powerful yet understated style. A lot of times people talk about how he's able to make things work with just the fewest amount of lines possible. He was really good at doing stories where he's able to contrast light and dark and shadows and things like that. You don't get a whole lot of that in these stories, but if you ever look up his art, it's just really striking, and it's really, like I said, powerful without being filled with lots of super detailed, but the quality and the control is definitely there. I read somewhere his quote, he made a quote where he said something like, I spent the first half of my career figuring out what to put into a drawing, and then the second half was figuring out what to take out. So he's really influential. Oh, and for people who probably know, or I'm not sure how many people know, but he went on to Hollywood during the 70s, and he did a lot of character designs. He did character designs for the Super Friends TV show. He did designs for the Thundar show, which Jack Kirby also used to work on. So there's that. Anyway, this story, Heart Divided, not really much of a story. It's only 3 pages. Basically, we have this woman and her boyfriend, and then her little brother. So the conflict is basically the boyfriend thinks that she spends way too much time taking care of her brother who's like 16, and he's all like, well, your family just dotes on this kid, and he's never going to amount to anything. You should let him grow up or whatever. And she's like, hey, that's my brother. I'm always going to look after him. And it looks like it's starting to come between them. But before anything serious happens, some other kid, and it's kind of confusing to see what happens. Some other kid runs to the house and says, hey, come quick. And between here and here, I guess what happened is some other kid jumped into the river or fell into the river, and the 16-year-old saved him. And so, because of that, the boyfriend now has respect for the little brother, and everybody lives happily ever after. Okay, alrighty. The next story is Chained to My Past, and the art is by, I think this is Nick Cardy. I'm not super familiar with Nick Cardy. He's a guy whose name I've heard before. I think he might have done more DC art back in the 60s than Marvel art. I'm not 100% on that one. That one, I'm not too, I'm just not as familiar with Nick Cardy as I am with some other artists. This story is a little bit better. It has a little bit more of an interesting conflict and resolve to it. So basically, we have this woman here who has, kind of come working for this dude here, and she really doesn't talk too much of her past. She's very withdrawn and closed in or whatever. And even though she's really just a secretary, he decides to take her along on a working vacation. And what ends up happening, they don't actually do too much work, hubba hubba, and they get to get to be a little bit closer and whatnot. And they start dating, and she's really kind of concerned and torn up about it. And she's all, he's like, what's wrong? What's wrong? She's like, don't ask any questions. I'm no good. This will never work. And she's really concerned about it, but then she decides to agree to marry the guy. So then she goes to meet his family, and then now we have the mean sister. So this is dude's mean sister. He's like, where do I know you from? I've heard about you, have seen you somewhere. And so she goes digging into it, and then she finds out about her brother's fiance, about the woman's past. I'm here for a showdown with you, Jenny Clayton. And basically, what had happened was the girl's mom and dad, there was all sorts of gossip about her mom maybe being promiscuous or whatever, even though it's worded in such a way that makes you think that it wasn't, it was just gossip. But dad went crazy and killed the mom. So that's the big skeleton in her closet. But, because of this happens, of course, she's ostracized as well. And it's oh so shameful and whatnot. And the sister's like, I'm not going to let you ruin my brother's life. You better leave town and forget about him. And so she leaves and she goes back to the old town and she thinks, I guess I'll just, she's just resigned to be unhappy. All right. And so there she is. And then, but here comes the dude. I've come to take you home with me, Jenny. And he basically says, hey, I found out what happened and I know and I don't care and I love you and we can still get married anyway. Okay, so there's that. So now here's the first story. I actually think this story is the best one. We're back to Alex Toth art, and basically what the point of this story is we have this guy and his wife, and the wife, they're in love. They have a decent marriage, but the wife is very ambitious, and she wants to have nice things and travel, and wants to live a better type of lifestyle than they're already living. It's not a terrible lifestyle, but she wants a little bit more out of life. And the husband just kind of does a lot of stuff just to make the wife happy. He's like, yeah, okay, well, I'll do these things if it'll make you happy. Now they're friends with this other couple, this guy and his wife, and they're very successful. They're very rich. They go jet setting. They go out to dinner all the time, and they hang out. So the first couple and the second couple hang out more and more, and the husband. The rich husband seems like he's a nice guy at first, and he's like, hey, don't worry about it. I'll pay for everything. La di da di da. The I'll say middle class husband, he's kind of like, yeah, I don't feel right about you paying for everything. He's got his pride as well. But the wife is like, oh, come on. These are our friends. He wants to be nice, la di da di da. So they hang out and whatnot. Okay, everything's fine. And then ultimately, rich husband offers middle class husband a job. And middle class husband, of course, isn't too sure about it at first. But again, he goes along with it to make his wife happy. All right. So now, after a while, we get to realize a middle class husband really isn't happy about it that much. First of all, he's got his own pride. Second of all, rich husband's kind of a dick. All right. So, he puts up with it as long as he can. And he starts saying, I'm going to quit. And she's like, oh, no, you can't quit. He's like, fine, whatever. But, we can tell he's about to reach his breaking point. So anyway, middle class husband has to go out of town for work. And rich husband invites the heroine over for dinner. And when she gets to their house, she realizes, oh, the other wife isn't there either. Oh my, okay, whatever. So rich husband starts putting the moves on middle class husband, and she's like, this really isn't right, whatever, whatever. And he's like, oh yeah, I planned all this. I had my wife leave for the evening, and I sent your husband out of town so we can be together, and you should divorce him and marry me, and la di da di da. And basically, he doesn't want to take no for an answer, and so middle class wife kind of leaves. She runs off, and she realizes, oh, what a fool I have been. and she runs back to her middle class husband, and they greet each other in the end. You know, she's realizes that middle class husband is the person that she really loves and who she should be with, and she should not be worried so much about material things and whatnot. This story was actually pretty interesting in the fact that it actually has a more, like I said, mature subject matter. It's about, of course, you know, it's about married couples and about the kind of issues that married couples actually face, you know, infidelity, finances, and things like that. So I was a little bit surprised by that story. So, okay, so I guess that's basically it. What else is going on here? There are not too many interesting ads or anything like that. Most of the ads are just, you know, classified ads for, oops, buying comics and stuff like that. Here you can get back issues of Eclipse comics. Oh, but they did have this in here, which is kind of interesting. There was a book called Women in the Comics, written by Trina Robbins, who was a pretty famous underground cartoonist in the 60s and 70s, and also Catherine, I don't know how to say her name, Iron Road or Iron Roadie. Iron Road actually sounds a little bit more sensible, I guess. And she is actually the editor in chief of Eclipse Comics at this particular time. But basically, they talk about different female creators and whatnot in this particular book. And the back cover is buttons based on other Eclipse comics that were being published. Laser Eraser and Press Button, I've never read that, but you got Scout, DN Agents, Miracle Man, Mask Man, Mr. Monster. I've heard good things about that, but I've never read it. Zot, Alien Counters, Crossfire. I've got a few issues of Crossfire laying around. Okay, so anyway, that's it. I got to thank you very much for watching my video. Any comments, please, you know, leave any opinions or anything you want to add or anything like that in the comments below. Thank you, and you have a great day.